This episode is brought to you by Audi. The road is calling. Embrace the thrill of the drive with the all-new, fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron. Featuring effortless power, serious acceleration, and advanced Audi tech. It's not just a new EV, it's a new way to experience driving. The all-new, fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron is here. The next chapter of Audi starts now.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Follow the Lead Podcast, a Christian Leaders Podcast powered by Greg Fay Insurance. If you haven't talked to my man, Greg Fay, do so today. Go to gregfayinsurance.com. Today on the podcast, Chase Replogle. Chase is a pastor of Brent Oak Church, a writer and podcaster, and he's the author of A Sharp Compassion, 7 Hard Words to Heal Our Insecurities and Free Us from Offense. He was referred to me by my dear friend, Justin Gravett. And when Justin refers someone, that comes with a ton of weight because he doesn't do it very often. You're going to love this conversation with Chase. He's an incredible writer. He's an incredible storyteller. I think you're absolutely going to enjoy it and lean into what it means to kind of deal with our insecurities. This episode is perfect for anyone who's wrestling with insecurity. So now, without any further ado, here's my conversation with Chase. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm so excited today to have pastor, author, podcaster extraordinaire, Chase Replogle. I messed it up. Even though I asked you, I still messed it up. Say your last name for me one
That's
more
all right.
time.
You should just leave it. I think it's all right. Replogle. Yeah, vote like Vogel. And some people know that name, Replogle.
Well, so far in our podcasting experience together, I have given you the wrong link and said your last name wrong. So things are going well. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Hey, I am glad to be here. And it's a hard last name. Not a great name for an author, right? So I probably should have had a pen name or something. It took me forever to learn to say it as a kid. So you did just fine.
Well, listen, man, you're doing so many things in the ministry world. You're involved in so many things. Are you currently hosting 3 podcasts, one for your church, one for how to read the Bible with kids, and then your Pastor Writes podcast? Do I have that right?
Yeah. The kids one, we kind of hit pause this summer, and we're actually looking at in the upcoming year, 2025, maybe rolling out a Let's Talk Bible for Adults podcast that goes through Luke and then corresponds with the kids one. So we're kind of in the middle of a pause, but there's about 22 episodes in the kids one, so we hope to bring that back next year. But yeah, I do that one, and then the pastor writer one, and then of course, as a pastor, you have sermons usually go out on a podcast as well.
Sure. So I'm kind of curious, from a macro perspective, how would you describe the calling that God has placed on your life?
Yeah, early on, it was as a pastor. I felt really strong. I thought I was going to law school. I was really involved in speech and debate in high school and had done well with that. And so I kind of had a path towards law, but I felt the Lord leading me into ministry. Came to a little Bible college, and started studying for ministry, and ended up going on to seminary. And then, first and foremost, that's how I see myself. I'm a pastor, but it's out of that pastoring, trying to navigate questions people have. But then, particularly as a pastor, you preach a sermon every 7 days, right? So you get 6 days, and then you're up again. And there were so often passages where I would find myself saying, "Man, I wish I had 3 or 4 weeks to just think more about that verse or that section." And writing came along really as a way for me to explore more deeply the scriptures and the questions my congregation was asking. And as I actually started pretty early on transcripting my sermons. I'll write them all the way out. I'm pretty loose with it in the pulpit, but I got in the discipline of really trying to figure out how I wanted to say what I wanted to say, and fell in love with that process of writing. And so the writing has come out of pastoring, but that podcast, Pastor Writer, is really a reflection of kind of how I understand my own calling. It's to pastor and also to do that through writing as well as speaking.
One of the things that I believe wholeheartedly is that as you grow in leadership, the ability to communicate and to write is paramount, right? Like you have to be able to do it, whether that's an email or book or an ebook or just website fodder, right? How has writing changed the way that you lead people?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I resonate with what you're saying too. A couple things on the writing. I really early on, I had an editor say to me, "Good writing is good thinking." And that really freed me because I was really caught up, like most writers, the idea of like, am I a writer? Is my writing good enough? I'm not producing the kind of writing that's like my favorite authors. And so recognizing that really writing is primarily about thinking, and the gift of writing is it helps you learn to think more clearly and articulate what you're thinking. And the other side of that was reminding myself, which I still do often, nobody reads what you write, they read what you edit. So you don't have to, just because you wrote it, doesn't mean you have to share it with the world. Some people should edit more, but you get to work on it and keep seeing it improve. That's the other thing I really like about writing. When you say it, it's out there, when you're speaking, but writing gives you a chance to come back again and again and really refine those processes. But I think as far as leadership, I love the idea of follow to lead, that we learn to become a leader first by following. And I think that process, writing is a long, slow process. I mean, the book that I just had come out is about 3 years, probably more if you count just my notes and thinking about it. I mean, these books are years worth of work. And the other thing about writing, people don't realize, it's solitary, right? I mean, I've worked on this book. It's funny, the book came out, and you get really excited for these launch days because everybody gets their copy in the mail. But then you have to temper your expectation because it might be months before they actually read it, right? Just because they have it doesn't mean they've read the book. So writing is this massive process of just patience and perseverance and believing that, with time and enough discipline, the work's going to improve. And that's in many ways how I think about pastoring as well, too, right? We have, our church name is called Bent Oak, which there's these bent oak trees around the Ozarks where I live. The Native Americans would tie down, they call them trail trees. They'd tie down these saplings. So when they would grow, they'll grow with this kind of crooked shape to them. And they're really easy to spot because they turn horizontal or parallel to the ground. So compared to all the other trees that are growing straight up, you can really see these trees. And they would use them to mark trails or to mark water or shelter. And I love that image because that's the kind of patience. I mean, if you tie down a tree, it might be 30, 40 years until it's big enough to mark a trail. But somebody did that work so that somebody else years later would be able to navigate the woods. And I think that's a model for me of what pastoral leadership is. It's patience, it's faithfulness over long periods of time. It's not trying to just fix people and move on. It's really about being present with people, coming again and again, week after week, year after year before the word. So yeah, writing, the patience writing has produced in me, I think has made me a better leader and pastor in that way as well.
I'm always fascinated by writers who do deep work. There's, as somebody who just reads a lot of books because of podcasting, and you know this as well, is that there's two different types of writers. They're the one who is writing to get a thought out, but there's one who's writing because they love the deep work of writing. And from my perspective, you definitely fall into that later category. And so I'm reading this book and I'm thinking about what it would be like to be a lead pastor who does 3 podcasts, who also has a family. And then I look on your Instagram and you're sailing and you're hunting. And I was like, holy smokes, right? When does Chase have time to do the deep work? And then I'm thinking about the leaders who listen to this podcast. And I'm like, a lot of these leaders struggle with finding space to do the deep work that elevates their leadership and their thoughts. How do you break that into your schedule and calendar?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it's one of the areas too where Instagram and social media personas may not be as real to form. Just because I'm doing a lot of work doesn't mean I'm doing it all well. I actually pastor a smaller congregation. My church is about 130 people, and I'm bivocational. So, and we have, from the very beginning, we've kept the church extremely simple. I mean, I've always felt like my call. Eugene Peterson used to talk about these 3 things, and it really resonated. It's to be prepared to preach. I want to study the word, and when I get into the pulpit, I want it to have done its work on me first, right? I want to preach out of having really wrestled with the passage. I want time to be with people. So I'm really passionate about, today I've got appointments, tomorrow I've got a lunch and a dinner with people. I really try to prioritize being with my congregation. And then I want time for prayer. I want to be able to pray over the study I'm doing. I want to pray over the people in my congregation. And that's it. I mean, we have a very limited kind of, everybody on our staff or our team that we stipend is part-time. And the church is really, really simple. And part of that's been, I think our people need that, and we could talk about that. But it's also, for me, I think this unique calling I have to pastor and write means, each of these things I'm perhaps approaching differently because of that. And so, I'm bivocational. So I try to work, I work with a few nonprofits outside of the church as well, too. And that kind of helps fund me to buy back a little bit of my time to work on things like the books that I want to. And so it's been, it's been really strategic. I've tried to build the kind of life and work that would create space for the writing. And that means, saying no to a lot of things. It means, I joke, we don't watch a lot of TV. I'm usually at night with a book in my hands when the kids go to bed. So, it's a cliche answer, but we find time, for what we need to. And for me, it's worked out. But it has been really intentional about kind of building the kind of life and work that will facilitate that space for the writing and thinking that I want to do.
What kind of work do you do with the nonprofits?
Yeah, so I do some writing. I'm doing increasingly more kind of curriculum or kind of helping people with book projects, but I also do a lot of kind of messaging writing for nonprofits. If you're around nonprofits, when people ask, what do you do? A lot of times it's this sort of spilling out of all the things we're passionate about and all the things we're involved in, especially when it comes to trying to work with donors or work with the broader public, being really, really clear and focused on what it is you're doing and accomplishing. So I work with nonprofits around messaging, trying to really make sure they're honing how they explain what they do and how they do it. And I have the opportunity to work with some great local nonprofits. The Warrior's Journey works specifically with military members. I'm pretty involved there. So yeah, meaningful work as well too. And still, as you sort of hear, still sort of tangentially related to the writing as well, right? So can I kind of double up as much of this work as possible?
Yeah, I'm the same way. So I'm bivocational, part-time,
great.
Associate pastor of disciple making. And then what I do then is pour into leaders through my coaching business and kind of run both simultaneously. How do you decide when to rest? Because I know that when you've got your hands in so many things, it's not like a lot of my full-time pastor friends who have a traditional Sabbath, they will just take okay, but one day a week, and maybe it's Friday into Saturday or something like that. But I'm sure there's opportunities for you to do church work or nonprofit work or writing work all the time. How do you determine what rest looks like in your rhythms?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've always struggled to get a full day.
Same.
So as you describe it, I understand that well. And that's not an excuse. I'm constantly trying to figure out if I can do better on that. But I think the thing I also really pay attention to is the kind of restlessness work that kind of goes on within your mind and your heart. And I feel that particularly, when you're working on a project or you're, writing on a book, and you can feel yourself working even when you're not working, and you can feel yourself obsessing. And what I'm really often trying to discern is, am I actually doing work, or am I doing things that I think are work that actually have no outcome, right? So is this just me worrying and fretting and endlessly searching and reading articles to try to figure out something so I can have a plan to fix something? Am I really working right now? Or do I imagine I'm working and really what I'm doing is just worrying and full of anxiety and stressing about what I actually can't control? And I try to get really honest with myself about that, right? When there's time to work, I want to do actual work. And when I'm not working, I want to leave those things on the desk and walk away and not be carrying around pretend work in my heart and in my head where I'm really just obsessing. So trying to get really clear about, what the work actually is that you're being called to do, what is actually in front of me to do, and can I just do that work? I think if you can do that, then it becomes much easier to then quiet your soul during those times of Sabbath, where you're not just still endlessly thinking about what needs to happen. You can just close the door to the work. And for us, it is often sailing, or we have horses. My wife grew up with that, so it's spending time with my kids there. And so, yeah, being present to those things, I think, becomes easier when you know what the work is and what the work isn't.
As I got the PDF copy of your book and started looking at kind of the arc of the writing, and the book is called A Sharp Compassion, 7 Hard Words to Heal Our Insecurities and Free Us from Offense. One of the first things that really piqued my curiosity was, how does someone come to the conclusion that we need to write a book on being offensive or on offense? And so I'm curious if you could walk me through that story of how God led you to this writing about offense.
Yeah, well, first it was me wanting to avoid it. So a few years ago as a pastor, you'll know this well. When we were in the middle of COVID, it felt like there was a year or two there where every week there was some other controversy breaking. And there was so much pressure for pastors to constantly weigh in on every single cultural issue. And I saw the way people in my congregation were having different views. I saw the way people were getting offended at everything online. Like the whole country just felt ratcheted up. I mean, we're in a season right now too, where I think people are feeling that perhaps in more ways than before, that kind of sensitivity, that outrage, offense. So I had this naive pastoral idea that what we would do is we would just go to one of the Gospels and I would spend a year preaching through. We would just talk about Jesus and somehow that would quiet all the controversy. And so we spent a year going through the Gospel of John. And what I kept realizing as I was preaching through that Gospel is Jesus was saying things that risked offending people and often did offend people.
Wow.
And he was having these conversations that were often filled with extremely hard words. This idea that I was going to avoid difficult conversations by going to Jesus was not what I found in the Gospels. And I got really interested in the way Jesus was using or risking offense in the Gospels, because you would find times where, and it wasn't just, we tend to imagine Jesus offending his opponents, right? Of course, he's going to say, you hypocrites, you brood of vipers, he's going to go at the Pharisees. But what I realized was Jesus was risking offense with his closest followers. He says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You've become an offense, a stumbling block to me." The way often he talks to his parents can be a little uncomfortable. We're not quite sure what point he's getting at. "Woman, what is it to me?" he says when she asks for him to deal with the wine that has run out at the party. He does it with random individuals, Jews and Gentiles, that he meets along the roads. At times, his disciples will say to him, "Don't you know that you offended the crowd? You offended the Pharisees?" And so I began to realize he was doing something with offense, because there's another story at the end of the Gospels where Jesus, one of the tax collectors, comes to Jesus and says, or actually comes to Peter and says, "Doesn't your master plan on paying the temple tax?" The temple tax was a gift that males would pay to support the temple and the priesthood. It wasn't required in the law, but it had become tradition. Some Jews were opposed to it. And so Peter comes back to Jesus and Jesus says, "Well, should the sons of the Father's house have to pay for the house?" And this is one of those moments where you expect Jesus to risk offense and to say to Peter, to say to the tax collector, "I don't have to pay this tax. Don't you know who I am?" But Jesus finishes that conversation by saying, "Lest we offend him, go and catch a fish, open his mouth, you'll find a coin in it, and pay the tax." We always remember the little coin in the fish's mouth miracle. But what really struck me was here was Jesus deciding not to risk offending someone. And so I began wrestling with, well, what is going on? How is Jesus so willing at times to offend people? And yet you have these stories where he chooses not to offend. And I began to realize that Jesus saw offense as a kind of issue of stewardship, a kind of tool that he could use. And it was used primarily to help reveal a person's heart or motives. Jesus would speak a hard word to force them to see their own inner life. This is the image of Jesus with a sword, that double-edged sword, his words that cut into the soul and spirit and divide. But Jesus wasn't willing to use offense to defend his own rights, to protect himself. "Don't you know I don't have to pay this temple tax?" He's not willing to risk offending for that. He's only willing to risk offending if it's a word of revelation to that person about their actual inner life. And so, of course, the greatest model is Jesus completely humiliated, stripped, mocked, hung on the cross. And what does he do in that moment? "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Even in this moment, he won't take offense for his own sake. But he's willing to risk hard conversations and hard words if it can help that person recognize a need that they're blind to in their own heart. And that got me really excited to recognize, I think there's something here for our broader culture and for us in a world where we're so increasingly sensitive to offense. Perhaps we need those hard words of Jesus right now, especially to see the things in our own lives that we become blind to that's leading us into all of this offense.
One of the things that you talk about in the book that I would love to hear more on is this idea that offense is addicting. Can you kind of walk us through that thought process and what led you to that conclusion, which I agree with? Offense does seem to be just one of those things that we all really want to be offended. And I'm not sure why. I don't really logically, it doesn't make sense. But yet when I read the words offense is addicting, I'm like, well, yeah, it is. I can't argue with that.
Well, a couple things are going on, I think. The Old Testament image for offense that the New Testament writers picked up is the idea of the stumbling block or the obstacle. So one of the things, offense is far more prominent in the New Testament than we realize, but it often gets translated in different ways. It'll be translated sometimes as to fall, sometimes as broadly as difficulty or sin, other times as offense, sometimes as stumbling block. That's often the same Greek word scandalon, from which we get scandal. And it has its roots in this Old Testament image of a person being blind to an obstacle that was in their path and tripping over that obstacle, so falling or stumbling over that obstacle. But the way that the Old Testament prophets would describe it was instead of getting up and recognizing, oh, there's an obstacle in my path, I'll go around it or change paths, that the person becomes increasingly obsessed with overcoming that obstacle and yet continues to stumble over it. And I think we all we know what that they're describing, right? Somebody offends you and you can't let it go. Somebody says something similar and you're even more supercharged to it and sensitive and offended. That offense has a way of sort of trapping us and tripping over the same thing and becoming obsessed with it. And their idea was that it's blocking your path, the thing that you're pursuing. That's where you tend to encounter this obstacle or that offense. So most of us are pursuing something, some meaning in life, something that we hold significant, some goal. And when we find those things belittled or challenged, or we don't receive the affirmation we think they deserve, those tend to be the places that we encounter the feeling of offense. And because, as the Old Testament prophets understood well, we're usually blind to those things. We don't recognize why it's offensive to us. The offense actually continues to make us more blind. We just trip over the same thing and get more and more frustrated and yet more and more obsessed with it. And I think you see that in the way we experience offense. That's usually the outrage produces more outrage. And the other thing about offense is it allows us to feel a sense of justification, of superiority even for what we're feeling. It has a kind of addictive quality, partly because it blinds us to introspection. It doesn't feel good to be offended, but instead of taking that wound and looking and asking, well, why does that bother me? Why did I feel so sensitive about that word? Why did I feel myself so quickly react when the person said that? Instead of that kind of introspection to ask hard questions, the offense allows us to externalize all of it, to put all of the blame on the other person, to feel a kind of righteous indignation at them, which actually begins to continue blinding us and blocking us to really the insecurity that's beneath that offense. So I think that's we trip over the same thing. And the more we trip over it, the more blind we become to why that obstacle is actually in our own heart. And we get trapped in this process of just offense that won't ever let us actually see its root causes in us, not just in the world.
Hey guys, just pausing this conversation with Chase to remind you to check out some of our incredible partners. Trent Barga over at the Barga team wants to help you get into your dream home, vacation home, or maybe an investment property. I love working with Trent and getting to know his story. He's got such a heart for ministry and for real estate. It's really the perfect combination. So if you have any questions about him, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to tell you a little bit more, or you can go to his website, which is in the links to the show notes, and get connected with Trent today. Also, don't forget to follow him on YouTube. He's got a ton of great content. Speaking of content, I'm so excited when I get to help someone get clear about where they're going and how they're getting there. That's a lot of the work I do over at Follow to Lead Coaching. And if you're ready for a 2025 that absolutely is a game changer, I would love to set up an exploratory call with you today. You can email me, Tony@TWMilt, and I would love to get connected with you to start your 2025 year off with an intentional plan. Now, let's finish up this conversation with Chase. Imagine that you're a leader who maybe is a C-suite executive or an entrepreneur, or nonprofit executive director, and you're listening to this dialogue, and you're like, "Oh my gosh, I'm stuck in the cycle of offense addiction." How are you coaching them? Like, what's the first step that they can take to break this cycle?
This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
It's a hard one, but I think what I see Jesus doing is he's helping connect insecurity and offense. And there's good research on this too. So the psychologists will tell us that the 2 places you're most likely, or the 2 elements that are most likely in the experience of offense is, number 1, the proximity to the person offending you. So we tend to be most offended not by a stranger, but by somebody we assumed was on our side or somebody we expected to be on our side. The example I give in the book is if a stranger walked up to you on the streets and said, "You're an idiot," you would probably think there's something wrong with him, right? Are they intoxicated? Are they insane? You wouldn't find it personally offensive. It might be annoying or irritating, but you wouldn't use the word offense, I don't think, in that situation. But if you're at a dinner party with friends and someone cracks a joke about your intellect, you're much more likely to be offended because that person you trusted or knew was the one who made you feel it. And the second element they add to that is insecurity. If somebody jokes about your looks and you don't really have any insecurities about your looks, perhaps you've given up, you're not going to be offended if they joke about that. But let's go back to intellect. If you really feel like other people are smarter than you, and this is a point of insecurity, you're much more likely to be offended by that joke if it's a place you're already insecure. And this is one of the big ideas of the book, that the way Jesus uses offense is he uses it as a tool to help reveal what's in a person's heart. So one way of thinking of it is offense. If you're willing to not move to outrage, if you're willing to pause for a moment and consider it, offense can actually be a form of revelation. What offends you can actually help lead you into your own heart to recognize why you were vulnerable to that offense. And what you will find is that usually that offense is connected to an insecurity, that's a vulnerability in your own life that's gone unresolved. And that's hard to do in that moment of outrage. But the first thing I would do is say, if you're experiencing offense, if you're just irritated by what people are doing and saying, I think the hard work is to begin looking, is there a pattern to that offense? And can I connect that pattern to actually an insecurity or vulnerability in myself that's leading me around sensitive and vulnerable to that experience of offense? I think those two, we don't always recognize how tightly connected offense and insecurity are.
Oh, that's really good. Now, what do you do if you're a leader and you've got someone in your organization who's caught in that addiction? Because you can't help, you know what I mean? Like all the things that you just suggested are really important and good. And also they're kind of intrinsic, right? They're native to us. If I see someone who's like causing a problem for the culture of the place that we're trying to call our work, or even, if you're parenting, how do you help a teenager see their offense and their need for it?
Yeah, I've been getting this question a lot, and I probably need to think more too, because certainly one of the outcomes of the book is I hope we can all get to a better place of having hard conversations, that we can sort of deal with our insecurity. For me, it's through Christ. He's the one that ultimately secures things. And because of that, I mean, theoretically, a person with no insecurity would be unoffendable, right? I think that's what you see with Jesus on the cross. Mm-hmm. This is a person who's secured all things in God. There's nothing you can do or say to Jesus that's going to offend him because he's not insecure or vulnerable. We struggle with that, right? So I hope we can find ways to start having meaningful conversations that are often hard conversations. But I think probably the first thing that needs to happen is we need to get really good at it as individuals. Yeah. If your team or your staff or your family or your kids perceive you as being insecure or vulnerable, or they're easily offended, they're probably not going to take hard words from you and you offending them very well either. You're going to get caught in this. They know exactly what to say to you because they see your insecurities perhaps better than you do, particularly teenagers, right? So they know where to push back. And then you are pushing on their insecurities because you see it and you're trying to help them. I think we each as individuals have to get really good at being secured in Christ, of being able to allow anybody to say offensive things to me without responding to that outrage and offense. And I actually think there's a quality of that becomes really desirable for people. When you meet somebody who seems so secure and has their identity so nailed down that you could say anything to them. They could hear hard words from anyone and they don't respond in outrage or offense, but they are a model of this kind of calm. I think people want that. I don't think we want to live in this constant, obsessive, insecure, offensive response. And so as a leader, I would say, and I know it would be nice if I could say, here are the 3 steps to having a hard conversation with an employee or a kid. But I think the work begins first and foremost with you becoming that kind of person, with you demonstrating to them that you do not take offense because of the security that you have from another source. And then I think that can become desirable in such a way that they're curious as to where that comes from in you because it's so rare in our world. So yeah, Jesus is my model. I talk about at the end of the book, imitating him because he does this well. If you begin to do that well, I think you'll see people wanting to imitate that in you too. And it makes those conversations a lot easier.
I'm curious from your perspective as you researched a lot of this stuff, when did we as a society become so sensitive?
There's a great tool Google has called the Ngram Viewer. It's fun to play around with. You put a phrase in, and it'll show you from its database of books and periodicals and the website, it'll show you the frequency of that phrase's use across time. You can go all the way back to the 1500s. So you can put a phrase in and see, is it used more today, more before? If you put the phrase "I'm offended" in, the graph, I think it's pretty hilarious. It literally is just right along the bottom. And then about 2000, it's just like a hockey stick. And then when you get to 2010, the line literally just goes vertical. So I worked out the math. In the last 100 years, the phrase "I'm offended" has increased in usage by 5,600%. Right? So, I mean, it's just like people have probably always been offended, but there's certainly a sense in which we are talking about offense way more than we were before. And everybody knows that's true, right? I went to the grocery store a while back, and there was a guy wearing a shirt that said, "I'm offended that you're offended," right? This is like the sentiment of our time and our culture. I think it has a lot to do with, again, if offense and insecurity are connected, I think we're living in a really insecure time. A lot of the things that we used to be able to trust for our identity, for our sense of belonging, for our sense of security, things like family and a faith community and the government itself, social institutions we were a part of. I mean, 200 or 300 years ago, you didn't have to think about who you were or what you were going to be or what you believed. You believed what your family believed, and you became probably what your father, mother were before you. You had a really secure path to walk. Although there might be challenges, you didn't have this existential angst you carried around. Well, we now live in a world where you can be anything you want to be, and you define what is most valuable to you, and you dream up what you imagine is a meaningful life, and you go out and pursue it on some great adventure, right? Which sounds great, but it also means you now entirely carry the weight of all meaning in your life. You bear complete responsibility for the value of your life, for your identity, and you alone define those things. And I think that's left us all really insecure. I mean, you talk to business leaders, the experience of imposter syndrome is so strong for people today because we're all pursuing some goal, but we never quite feel like we're living up to it. So it's true as a society. We no longer trust the government. We no longer trust churches. We're no longer involved in social institutions. We sort of live alone and addicted to things and scrolling Instagram and binging Netflix. I mean, it's not hard to see where people are desperately vulnerable and desperately insecure. And so what happens when we walk around with all of that insecurity, desperate for somebody to affirm us, but not getting it? Well, the outcome is offense, a sensitivity to offense. And I think that's what you see the world sort of constantly spiraling into greater and greater cycles of offense. So again, connected to insecurity. And I think we just live in a really insecure time.
Do you have any hope that that time will end?
I mean, I think people are seeing some of it on the larger cultural scale. I mean, I think we're increasingly recognizing that being alone has devastating consequences, that the lack of deep friendships, particularly in men, you look at like some of the suicide rate. I've done some work on a men's book before. Some of the suicide rates in older men who don't have friends is really disturbing. So I think we're realizing, we're alone, we're unhealthy, we don't belong to anything. I think you're starting to see people the big risk we thought of the new atheist movement, that people would just walk away from faith, has not panned out. Now people are in a kind of consumer where they're kind of looking for whatever faith fits them. But there is at least an openness, I think, to faith that maybe 20 years ago we imagined in the secular West wouldn't exist. So I'm hoping, people will begin again to find some of that security and meaning through Christian faith. So I think there's opportunities. I'm not hopeless about this. But each of us, I think, have to be really honest about we're living with a lot of insecurity, and there's going to be consequences to that insecurity if we don't learn to secure those things. For me, ultimately in Christ, I think that's the only thing that really can give you that kind of confidence you need to overcome offense.
As this book gets out into the wilderness, I'm always curious what it must be like from your perspective as the author of like, what does it feel like? What's it mean? So as this kind of like seeps out into the world, what are some of the ways that we can kind of pray alongside you for this book and just the feelings that you've been experiencing as this leaks out there?
Yeah, man, I really appreciate that question. I think one of the definitions of a good book is it gives us language to have conversations that we didn't have language for. So a good book, I sometimes will talk about the 5 love languages because everybody knows
Sure.
that. Everybody was dealing with issues of communicating, giving and receiving love in relationships. But that book came along and gave us language to be able to talk about it. And I think that's why that book did so well. I hope this book gives us language for beginning to actually understand offense when we experience it, that it's no longer a blind spot, a feeling, but when we feel ourselves offended, we now have some tools and some language to explore that deeper within ourselves and perhaps even to talk about it with others. So I hope the book gives language to the experience that makes it useful for people. And I do hope it, at the end of the day, I hope it helps you read Jesus and Jesus's stories better, because I think that's where this has to ultimately come. And G.K. Chesterton, a great British writer, said use the image of having 2 eyes. That we actually see the world with 2 different images, 2 different vantage points, because there's space between your eyes. You actually see everything at 2 different angles, and your brain combines those 2 images. And it's because of that space, those 2 angles, you actually get a better perception of depth. So if you only had one eye, or if you've ever had to wear had an eye surgery and had to wear a patch, you lose a lot of your spatial awareness, your depth, because you only have one vantage point. And Chesterton says that that's how we often can see spiritual truths too. That Jesus, we have one angle on Jesus, which is he is kind and he is patient and he is compassionate. He's meek. But the other vantage point, the other angle we get on Jesus in the Gospels is that he is also quick to speak the truth, quick to speak a hard word. His words, like a sword, are willing to divide into our own souls. And it's when you hold together those 2, we want Jesus to be one or the other, right? We want Jesus to just be a cursing brawler who just takes down people, or we want him to be just like with children and sheep in the field. But yeah, it's exactly right. But when you get these 2 images together, you get a depth to who Jesus is. And that's the thing more than anything else I worry that we're losing, is we need the kind of Jesus that can speak hard words into us, because that's where healing actually takes place. And so I hope the book will give you an encounter with Jesus and his hard words in such a way that they would work real healing in those places of insecurity in your life. And that we could hold those 2 images together going forward. We need both of those if we're going to heal what's broken.
Amen to that. A year from now, what are we celebrating about what God has done on your platforms, whether that be the Pastor Writer or the Let's Read the Bible podcast, or the your next book or this book? What are we celebrating about the outlets that you get to have influence over?
I'm a man of low vision, so I don't tend to cast large visions into the future. I'm all about, as we talked about everything I'm doing, I'm all about what is the work in front of me. So I often don't have a great sense of long-term where God is taking that. But I would say, I hope a year from now, I hope the Holy Spirit and the Lord is still stirring things in me to investigate and to write. And so that's true now. There's things I'm thinking about and possibly working on next. And so I hope a year from now, in so many ways, I hope I'm doing what I'm doing now. I hope, the Lord's helping me see things in my own heart, and he's helping me use the tools of writing to bring those to other people. And through that work, all of us are pursuing Christ in a better way. So man, I hope a year from today, I hope I'm doing a great podcast like this one. And I hope I'm closing the Zoom call afterwards and opening a Word doc and working on whatever project comes next.
I have one more question for you. Actually, 2, I think. But before I ask it, I know that my podcast family is going to want to connect with you all over the interwebs. Where is the best place to learn all things Chase?
Sure. Well, because Replogle is a hard word to say or spell, Pastor Writer, everywhere is Pastor Writer. So if you do pastorwriter.com, it'll take you to my podcast. You can email me there. I'd love to hear. But you can also just on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook, Pastor Writer. And the book, any of those places you can find the link. But if you go to asharpcompassion.com, just the title of the book, asharpcompassion.com, there's more information about the book. There's an online assessment you can take. So it'll give you even a % score on maybe how you might be experiencing offense in your own life. And again, you can reach out to me there if you read the book or have questions or thoughts. I love hearing from readers, so feel free to shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you.
So I love to ask advice questions, and I'm going to invite you to go back and give yourself one piece of advice, except I get to name the season of life that you're in. Right. And so I really do believe that you have an incredible heart of a pastor. And so I want to take you back to the very first sermon that you've ever preached, right? You just finished preaching this sermon to this kind of this crowd that was no doubt enthralled by all the words that you used, right? If you could pull that younger version of yourself off to a side room, sit knee to knee with him, hold his hands, look him in the eye, and give him one piece of advice about the journey he's about to go on, what are you going to tell him?
I'll probably end up making two. See, I always make 2 points out of 1 point. So I'll say it in one sentence and then I'll explain it. I would say the sermon you just preached does not matter as much as you think it does. And that's because what matters far more is a decade of preaching. Yeah. What matters far more is a decade of work, especially when you're young. And I was young, it's really hard to see that way. But increasingly, I realize what my people need from me as a pastor is not a great sermon. What they need is a decade of me being a faithful pastor who knows them personally, and week after week, I'll take B sermons week after week after week in relationship with people than, the occasional A+ sermon. That faithfulness to work and to congregation and to family, I believe in that more and more. We live in the time where everything's sort of big and everything's launch and promotion and sales. And I just want to be a faithful, steady presence in my preaching and my work and my parenting and my relationships. So I would tell my young self, my very excitable young self, great work, but just know you've got thousands more of these to go. And that faithfulness matters more than just that single home run you're shooting for.
Sunday comes every single week. Every single week. Okay, bonus question. I don't normally ask this, but because I love your style of writing and because I think you're a good writer, I'm curious to get your opinion. I am, this is totally for me. So podcast family, if you want to just ignore
go ahead. I love it.
I just signed my first solo book deal. And I'm working on a project that, like you said, that's been ruminating for years. And I am staring down the barrel of, I basically have about 40,000 words left. What's your number one tip to an aspiring writer?
Oh, well, you're pretty far along. I mean, often I'll say to writers, write, which seems obvious, but I mean, it sounds like you're doing that. I think there's so much great writing advice out there, but I think you have to figure yourself out as a writer and you have to do what works for you. You can get really trapped in this great writer with this writing course says I have to write 500 words a day, and that's the secret to getting things done. Somebody else will say, here's the perfect format for a chapter. You need these 3 stories. And you could literally spend, which writers love to do this. They love to not write and they love to read about writing, right? So,
you're stepping on my toes
me feel like a writer.
Now.
Yeah, well, trust me, I know it well too. So I'm going to listen to this craft book on writing and convince myself I'm making progress as a writer. You have to write. But you have to figure yourself out as a writer and you have to do what you have to do to get the work done. So I don't have a daily writing habit. I tend to keep notes in my notes app and they just build and build and build as I'm always thinking about the next thing until the point of absurdity. Like I'm basically writing the thing in my notes app. So then I jump into a Word doc and I'll often knock out a long chapter in one sitting just because it's been building and building until I have to write it. And so I tend to write in seasons, right? So I'll build up a bunch of time and then take a whole day off and just write. That may change, but you have to figure out, especially with a deadline, like I got to get 40,000 words done, right? You got to figure out what motivates me to keep working on the project, what works for me to actually get the work done. And then you have to give yourself permission to do that, right? Even if that process looks a little different than someone else. And I'll say to you again, too, I mean, it sounds like you know this, but nobody will read what you write. They read what you edit. So, it gets, especially early on, you want to write it so well. You get disappointed because you write a first draft and it's not what you thought it would be. That's okay. Get something down. And then you can work on it and keep seeing it get better. And that's where I enjoy the writing process, is when I can see it getting better. But that takes the work of getting something down to start with. So yeah, find the way that you can do the work best. Don't be afraid to get something down and then keep making it better.
Love it. Chase, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today, for putting great work out into the world, and for your heart for the church and for helping people follow Jesus. It really does matter. And just thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm honored to do it, and I love talking to fellow bivocational pastors, so I think it's a great way. We'll have to do it again and talk just about that sometime. That's a passion as well.
I would love
But
that.
really, really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having me.
Man, what a great conversation. I really appreciated the 7 hard words: offense, insecurity, obsession, imitation, affirmation, accusation, and healing. I think there's so much in here that is important for us as Christians and as Christian leaders specifically. So, hey, if you enjoyed this conversation, do me a favor. Let Chase know that you heard him here on the podcast. Maybe go follow his podcast, the Pastor Writer Podcast. He's got some great guests. I know you're going to love it. As always, super thankful for you, for the connection that we have on this platform. And remember, guys, if there's anything I can do for you, I'm embarrassingly easy to find. And if you want to follow Jesus, you must be willing to move.